And yet to take an 18-year-old, whether it's a US or Japanese or German or Chinese, and be able to turn that 18-year-old into someone who is capable of doing really horrific things to complete strangers for reasons of state is a very unnatural act. It takes a lot of conditioning. And so there's a lot of dehumanization that goes on, both of the perpetrator as well as the victim. And I think this carries over into the way, in order to do these things, you have to dehumanize. But if you dehumanize, you can't really get into the mindset of your adversaries. And if you can't get into their mindset, you can't understand what's motivating them. If you don't understand what motivates them, you can't get them to stop doing whatever it is that you went to war to get them to stop doing in the first place. And so could you talk about that process of misunderestimation of the psychology of the adversary, if I can quote President Bush, and how that impacts the war, not just World War II, but the wars in Iraq post 9/11, the way we approach our adversaries and that mentality?
Well, in the book I wrestled with these under several concepts, and this goes back to our failures of intelligence, and I have a chapter called The Failure of Imagination, and this is where I go back to Pearl Harbor, and why did the Americans fail to anticipate the Japanese attack? Why did the Americans fail to anticipate the Japanese military capabilities? You can turn that around, which I do, and say, why did the Japanese fail to imagine the American response? And they totally missed how the Americans would respond, as well as our capacity and will to remember Pearl Harbor and get revenge. That was one of the posters, avenge Pearl Harbor. That was a standard phrase. And the same thing occurs in the case of Al-Qaeda and 9/11, and then it transfers, and this is where my book, which was going to be a short book, suddenly became a big book, because I began trying to wrestle with these various different questions before the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Now, when the U.S. invasion of Iraq took place, 18 months after 9/11, in March 2003, we had another colossal failure of intelligence on the part of the United States, and a colossal failure of imagination on the part of the United States. So if you come back to the U.S. perspective, you say, there was an incredible intelligence and imagination failure in 1941. There was another in 2001. And instead of that getting us to think about who is this adversary, to know the enemy, we get into an even more disastrous war in the case of Iraq, where the intelligence failure is simply colossal. And that involves an inability to imagine the other side. And it is not to sympathize with the other side. That's not the point. The point is to imagine the other side, and one, to imagine the nature of their grievances. And of course, the argument after 9/11, and still pretty much, is they hate us for our freedoms. They have no legitimate grievances. The argument was, the Iraqis are under a brutal dictator, which they were. They will greet us as liberators, totally overlooking the nature of that society and the fact that nobody likes to be invaded and occupied, totally missing those kind of things. And the second thing was a failure of imagination to imagine the capabilities of people we look down upon because they were materially inferior, and that's where racism and ethnocentrism and other things come in, that we did not think they had the capacity to wreak havoc upon us. And we went into the war on terror and the war in Iraq still thinking we could win with big war, and we could win with shock and awe. And, shock and awe, this is where all of the things started ricocheting in my mind, and that I was trying to publish it, but to write something, to figure it out myself. Shock and awe is one of the key phrases comes Iraq. In journalism everywhere, we will go in, we will so shock and awe them with our massive display of firepower that they will cave. Psychological warfare. Mm-hmm. Shock and awe is a doctrine that is kind of a Bible in Pentagon circles. It's a formal book and study, very well known, and the model is Hiroshima and Nagasaki, explicitly, not necessarily using nuclear weapons, but our superior firepower will so intimidate these other people that they will give in. They will realize it's hopeless to fight against us. We were not able to imagine insurgency movements. We were not able to imagine people who were motivated not necessarily by Islamist fundamentalism, but by hatred of being occupied. We were not able to imagine the way they viewed recent history. Right or wrong, the way they remembered history is very important. And it just didn't enter into planning and thinking at the topmost levels. So then you get into why people think the way they do, and why they people at the top fall into these patterns. These apparently rational people fall into patterns of thinking which are irrational. And then I began to wrestle with the concept of rationality and irrationality among people who are, in fact, very intelligent and knowledgeable. The Japanese in World War II, the Americans in the Bush administration, they're smart people. Why was it so irrational? And then you get into a concept which fascinated me, which is groupthink.
Exactly. That's something I want to come back to at the end, because I think that's one of the most important chapters in your book, actually. It's short, but it's beautiful and it's so rich. But again, we fall into this pattern of thinking that our bombs are virtuous bombs. Our bullets are virtuous bullets. People won't mind so much if we accidentally bomb them and destroy their homes or wedding parties or whatever, that they'll somehow forgive us. And yet they have a way of bombs have a way of uniting people under a common threat, to experience a common trauma, as 9/11 was to the United States. To have bombs drop on your head in some other country is also quite unifying in many ways. And just the psychology, if I lose electricity from a thunderstorm in my building, I get furious. If I lose water pressure, I'm upset. I can't imagine what it's like to have bombs fall in the city and destroy your infrastructure and to have to live through that for year after year. But we're going to cut away for a short break, and we'll come back and we'll pick up on these themes.